June 22, 1941, marked one of the most dramatic and consequential days of World War I. On this, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of the Soviet Union that would forever alter the course of history. Millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, and endless columns of trucks surged eastward across the vast plains, moving at a pace that stunned both allies and enemies alike. In just the first days, German forces captured enormous territories, pushing deep into Soviet lands and striking fear into towns and cities along the way. But behind the apparent speed and power lay a growing problem. The farther the Wehrmacht advanced, the more stretched their supply lines became. Fuel, ammunition, food, and medical supplies struggled to keep up with the rapid progress of tanks and mechanized units. Commanders faced the constant challenge of balancing the thrill of swift victories with the practical realities of logistics. Every mile deeper into Soviet territory intensified the risk, and what seemed like unstoppable momentum was already sowing the seeds of vulnerability. Meanwhile, Soviet soldiers and civilians were not passive observers. Stalin's orders for scorched earth tactics, the evacuation of factories, and the mobilization of partisans created a landscape of resistance that would slow and challenge the German advance in unexpected ways. The tension between rapid conquest and resilient defense set the stage for a conflict that would test the limits of strategy, endurance, and human courage. In this video, we will explore the opening weeks of Barbarossa, examining the daring moves, the strategic dilemmas, and the human stories behind the headlines. If you are fascinated by history, military strategy, and the incredible resilience of people in wartime, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you do not miss any of our deep dives into World War I history. Trust me, you will want to see how this epic campaign unfolds. As the German forces pushed deeper into Soviet territory, the exhilaration of rapid advances began to collide with the harsh realities of logistics and strategy. The sheer scale of Operation Barbarossa was staggering. Millions of soldiers, armored divisions racing across thousands of kilometers, and an endless stream of mechanized units striving to maintain momentum. Yet, amid this impressive display of military might, a critical tension emerged among the German high command that would shape the unfolding campaign. Guderian, the visionary architect of armored warfare, was convinced that speed was the ultimate weapon. He believed that the key to victory lay in relentless, unbroken advances, keeping the Soviets off balance and denying them the opportunity to regroup or fortify their positions. Every hour that the panzers were delayed was, in his, a missed opportunity to capitalize on the element of surprise and the initial shock of the invasion. In stark contrast, Kluge, a seasoned commander with a deep understanding of operational risk, urged caution and consolidation. He saw the rapid movement of armored units as a double-edged sword, exposing the spearhead to potential isolation, vulnerable supply lines, and the ever-present threat of counterattacks. To him, the advance had to be measured, with infantry units and logistical support carefully positioned to secure captured territories and maintain the integrity of the front. The disagreement between Guderian and Kluge was not simply a matter of personality or pride. It reflected a fundamental dilemma in modern warfare: the balance between daring initiative and disciplined coordination, between the lure of immediate gains and the practical necessities of sustained operations. Halder, the chief of staff, found himself navigating between these conflicting approaches. Recognizing both the brilliance in Guderian's vision and the prudence in Kluge's caution, he understood that without careful oversight, the Wehrmacht risked overextension in a land as vast and unforgiving as the Soviet Union, where a single misstep could transform triumph into disaster. Orders were issued, sometimes contradictory, as Hitler himself intervened, redirecting objectives and shifting priorities, further complicating the chain of command. The tension between rapid panzer advances and the slower, Methodical support of infantry units was not just a matter of military theory, it manifested on the ground in tangible ways. Armored columns racing through forests and open plains while supply trucks struggled over damaged roads. Communication lines stretched to the breaking point. And commanders at the front making split-second decisions under immense pressure. Within this maelstrom of movement and command, the human element was never far from the surface. Soldiers experienced both the exhilaration of swift victories and the anxiety of being ahead of their own support, knowing that a single Soviet counterattack could trap them miles from reinforcements. Staff officers labored tirelessly to coordinate advances, often contending with incomplete intelligence, shifting objectives, and the unpredictable resistance of Soviet forces who refused to surrender or retreat easily. Every encirclement, every breakthrough, carried with it both tactical glory and strategic risk, and the consequences of misjudgment were immediate and unforgiving. This interplay of speed and consolidation, audacity and caution, would define the first phase of Barbarossa, shaping not only the outcomes of battles but the trajectory of the entire campaign. It illuminated the strengths of German operational planning while exposing its vulnerabilities, particularly when faced with the vastness of the Soviet landscape and the resilience of its defenders. The story of Guderian, Cluj, and Halder serves as a window into the complex calculus of war, where decisions made in command tents reverberate across hundreds of kilometers of front lines, affecting the lives of tens of thousands of soldiers and the fate of cities and regions. In the end, the struggle to reconcile rapid advances with secure consolidation became more than a tactical question. It was a test of leadership, judgment, and the fragile balance between ambition and prudence in the face of an enemy determined to resist at every turn. As the German panzers tore across the western Soviet plains, the defenders on the ground faced a crisis of unimaginable scale, and at the heart of the Soviet response was a strategy as audacious as the German advance itself. Stalin, recognizing that speed alone could not halt the Wehrmacht, enacted a scorched earth policy that transformed the very landscape into a weapon against the invaders. Fields were burned, crops destroyed, and infrastructure dismantled, leaving nothing of value for the advancing army. Trains, livestock, and even the simplest supplies were removed or annihilated, forcing German troops to confront a hostile territory stripped bare of resources, where every mile forward required improvisation, risk, and extraordinary effort to maintain supply lines. In the midst of this, factories, machinery, and critical armament production were relocated hundreds of kilometers eastward, a logistical feat that demonstrated not only the Soviet capacity for organization under pressure, but also the lengths to which a nation could go to survive in the face of existential threat. Amid these calculated destructions, another layer of resistance unfolded quietly but persistently. Partisan warfare, groups of civilians and soldiers operating behind enemy lines sabotaged railways, bridges, and communication lines, striking where the Wehrmacht least expected and turning occupied territories into arenas of constant uncertainty. Every act of disruption, every rail line blown up, forced the German command to divert attention and resources to rear area security, slowing the advance and testing the resilience of units already stretched to their limits by the speed-focused strategies of commanders like Guderian. For the German soldiers, the landscape became a labyrinth of danger, where even the seemingly simple act of moving forward could be met with hidden traps, ambushes, or the absence of the expected supplies, making each victory hard-won and fraught with peril. At the same time, the evacuation of cultural treasures added a poignant dimension to the war effort, revealing that the Soviet struggle was not only military but profoundly human and symbolic. Artworks, gold, jewels, and manuscripts were transported eastward under the looming threat of aerial attacks, illustrating a determination to preserve the nation's heritage even amid chaos. museums emptied, train cars loaded with priceless items traversed hostile territory, and every successful relocation was a small victory against the erasure that the invasion threatened to impose. Factories that would have been vital for sustaining military production were dismantled and rebuilt in distant regions, ensuring that even as German tanks captured territory, the Soviet war machine could continue to function and adapt, turning strategic retreats into preparations for counteroffensives that would come later. The combination of scorched earth tactics, partisan activity, and evacuation operations created a landscape that was both physically and psychologically hostile to the invaders. German commanders, already negotiating the tension between rapid armored advances and infantry consolidation, now faced an environment where every mile forward was contested not just by troops, but by a strategy that turned the very land against them. Roads became corridors of vulnerability, towns emptied of sustenance, and supply chains stretched to breaking points, demonstrating that the Soviet response was as much about endurance and ingenuity as it was about outright combat. In this way, the early phase of Barbarossa revealed the intricate dance between aggression and resistance, where speed, audacity, and tactical brilliance met the deliberate, patient, and often invisible strategies of a population and leadership determined to survive. The story of these weeks illustrates that warfare is never only measured by territory gained or battles won, but also by the resilience of those who refuse to surrender the resources, culture, and spirit of their homeland, turning retreat into preparation and destruction into a weapon of defense. While the Wehrmacht clashed with Soviet forces on the Eastern Front, the wider world was far from idle, and the ripple effects of Operation Barbarossa quickly extended across continents. In the Pacific, Japanese strategists weighed the prospect of joining the German offensive by striking against the Soviet Union, an idea that promised to divert Red Army forces from the European front and potentially accelerate Germany's conquest. Yet, despite the appeal of such a coordinated effort, the Japanese leadership ultimately concluded that the risks outweighed the benefits. Instead, their ambitions turned southward toward Indochina, a decision shaped by the promise of resources, strategic bases, and the expansion of influence in Southeast Asia. This calculated choice would soon bring them into direct tension with Western colonial powers, particularly Britain and the United States, while leaving the Soviet Union free to redeploy troops from Siberia without the immediate threat of a second front. A strategic advantage that would prove critical in the early stages of the Eastern Campaign. Meanwhile, across the Middle East and the Mediterranean, Allied forces were busy consolidating their positions and challenging Axis ambitions. The British, adjusting to the new leadership of Claude Auchinleck in the Middle Eastern theatre, engaged in a series of maneuvers that tested both strategy and stamina. Battles in Syria and Palmyra highlighted the interplay between mobile forces and entrenched defenders, as mechanized cavalry, infantry, and air units clashed to secure supply routes and strategic positions. Naval engagements, too, underscored the global reach of the conflict. German dive bombers sank the Australian warship Waterhen off Sidi Barrani. Yet within days the Allies exacted retribution when the cruiser Sydney struck down the Italian Bartolomeo Colleoni, demonstrating that control of the seas remained contested and unpredictable. Each skirmish, each capture of territory, reflected not just a military calculation but a broader struggle for influence, trade routes, and the ability to project power across oceans and deserts alike. The convergence of these global dynamics shaped the operational environment on both the European and Eastern fronts. The Japanese expansion into Indochina and the associated diplomatic maneuvering created pressure points far from the battlefields of Belarus and Ukraine, reminding both Axis and Allied planners that the war was not confined to a single theater. Intelligence networks, including broken diplomatic codes, allowed the United States and its allies to anticipate moves in Southeast Asia, adding a layer of strategic foresight that would influence subsequent campaigns. At the same time, local populations and colonial authorities in territories like Indochina, Syria, and the Mediterranean found themselves caught between advancing armies, shifting allegiances, and the logistical realities of modern warfare, where railways, ports, and roads became as valuable as tanks and rifles. As these events unfolded, the interconnectedness of the global conflict became unmistakable. Decisions made in Tokyo affected the pace and positioning of Soviet defenses, while movements in North Africa and the Middle East rippled through the calculations of European commanders. The war was no longer simply a series of isolated fronts. It was an intricate web of operations, diplomacy, and strategy, where each choice had consequences far beyond the immediate battlefield. In this context, the early weeks of July 1941 reveal not only the ferocity of Germany's push into the Soviet Union, but also the subtle, decisive ways in which the broader world responded, adapted, and prepared for the challenges that lay ahead, demonstrating that even in the midst of monumental clashes, the global chessboard of war remained in constant motion, shaping outcomes and futures across continents. While battles raged across Europe, the Middle East, and the Soviet steppes, another, less visible front of the war was quietly unfolding in laboratories, workshops, and research facilities, where scientists and engineers raced against time to develop technologies that could shift the balance of power. In Britain, the relentless push of German U-boats across the Atlantic had already highlighted the need for superior detection and tracking systems, and this urgency gave rise to significant advances in radar technology. Operating on the 10-centimeter wavelength, these new radar systems could detect periscopes from kilometers away and provide early warnings of approaching aircraft or submarines, turning previously invisible threats into manageable challenges. The development of radar did more than safeguard convoys or warn of enemy attacks. It represented a fundamental leap in the ability to process information, coordinate responses, and plan operations with a level of precision that had been unimaginable just years earlier. Parallel to these technological strides, a quieter but potentially world-altering scientific endeavor was underway: the WWII project. Conceived by some of Britain's most brilliant minds, WWII was the codename for Britain's exploration into nuclear fission and the possibility of harnessing uranium-235 as a source of unimaginable energy. While many envisioned its application as a weapon capable of ending conflicts in an instant, the research also considered broader uses, including the generation of power, reflecting a vision of science that could extend beyond mere destruction. Wallace Akers, the project's director, oversaw a network of researchers, laboratories, and facilities, carefully balancing secrecy with the need for rapid progress. The work was meticulous, painstaking, and inherently risky, but each breakthrough, each theoretical calculation, brought the Allies closer to a transformative understanding of atomic energy, one that could redefine not only military strategy, but the very nature of modern civilization. The significance of these scientific advances cannot be overstated. While German tanks advanced across the Soviet Union and Japanese forces recalibrated their ambitions in the Pacific, the British scientific community was constructing a different kind of arsenal, one where intelligence, theory, and innovation became the weapons of choice. Radar installations began appearing along coasts and strategic locations, providing both defensive capability and confidence to commanders on multiple fronts. WWII, though still in its early stages, demonstrated the foresight of a nation anticipating that victory in modern war would depend not only on boots and guns, but on the ability to harness knowledge in ways the enemy could not immediately counter. Moreover, these developments were interwoven with the broader narrative of the war. The German advance into the Soviet Union highlighted the value of mobility, speed, and coordination on the battlefield. But radar and nuclear research emphasize the parallel importance of information, prediction, and technological edge. Commanders could only act as effectively as their intelligence allowed, and each advancement in detection or computation created opportunities for strategic advantage. Scientists, far from the front lines, became integral actors in a war where victory depended equally on insight and innovation. In laboratories, equations and experiments carried consequences as profound as any maneuver on the steppes of Russia or the deserts of North Africa, underscoring the multidimensional nature of a global conflict that extended beyond territory to encompass knowledge, foresight, and the power to reshape the future. Through the lens of radar and tube alloys, the war reveals itself not only as a clash of armies, but as a collision of intellect and ingenuity, where the fate of millions hinged as much on scientific discovery as on courage in combat. In this sense, the early weeks of July 1941 illustrate the dual realities of World War I, a world in which the roar of guns and the clatter of tanks was mirrored by the quiet hum of laboratories, where each breakthrough had the potential to redefine the very rules of warfare and alter the trajectory of history itself. As the Wehrmacht pushed deeper into Soviet territory, the human cost of the invasion became horrifyingly clear. Alongside military victories and strategic maneuvers, a dark and deliberate campaign of violence was unfolding behind the front lines. In occupied towns and cities, early mass killings of Jewish civilians began, marking the grim start of a systematic effort that would escalate in brutality as the war continued. Families were torn from their homes, synagogues desecrated, and communities decimated, all carried out with the chilling efficiency of a regime driven by ideological hatred. The terror was not limited to civilian populations. Soviet prisoners of war were captured in staggering numbers, often denied the protections afforded under international law, subjected instead to harsh conditions, starvation, and summary executions. The Commissar Decree and other directives gave German soldiers free rein to treat captives with extreme cruelty, reflecting an ideology in which enemies were dehumanized and moral restraints were deliberately abandoned. These atrocities revealed that Operation Barbarossa was far more than a conventional military campaign. It was a collision of competing ideologies, a struggle in which the conquering force sought not only to subjugate territory, but to annihilate entire populations and impose a worldview rooted in racial and political extremism. Reports from the field documented mass shootings in Kovno, Vilna, Tarnopol, and Lvov, while ghettos were established and prominent citizens, including intellectuals and academics, were targeted for execution. The scale and speed of these crimes shocked even some within the German ranks, demonstrating how deeply ideology had permeated military planning and execution. For the Soviets, the invasion demanded not only tactical responses but moral and psychological endurance. Scorched earth policies, partisan warfare, and the evacuation of factories and treasures were matched by the necessity to preserve lives, culture, and the spirit of resistance in the face of an enemy determined to destroy both the body and the soul of the nation. The opening weeks of Barbarossa thus stand as a stark illustration of the dual realities of war. The technical brilliance and rapid advances of the German army, contrasted against the unimaginable human suffering wrought by ideological zeal. Commanders grappled with operational dilemmas. Scientists raced to create new technologies, and governments maneuvered on global chessboards. Yet beneath all the strategy lay the irreversible consequences for millions of people caught in the tide of conquest. It is a reminder that history is shaped not only by victories and defeats, but by the choices of individuals and nations, and by the courage, resilience, and suffering of those who endure in the shadows of epic events. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most pivotal moments of World War I. If you found this story compelling and want to continue exploring the extraordinary events and human experiences that shaped history, please make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Your support helps us continue to bring these stories to life and ensures that the lessons of history are never forgotten.